They made her open her hand and show the blankness beneath the skin, as if her worth could be proved by the absence of marks. A candle trembled on the table between them. Its flame answered nothing. If this story moves you, stay with it a moment. Subscribe and like to follow more lives laid bare by history. Some lines here are dramatized from testimonies and contemporary accounts to give voice to moments that otherwise survive only in fragments. She arrived, small as a gull, eyes too wide for the coffin of a ship. The ocean had taught her a sound that would never leave, the low, endless rubbing of wood and water, like a pen dragging over paper. They took her from whatever name the sea had first given her and gave her another, a household's possession, a label to fold her into English speech. The Wheatley household in Boston became the shape of her days. A kitchen that smelled of soap and boiled meat, a parlor that smelled of oil lamps and ink, children whose laughter had a lower pitch than the songs she remembered, and a woman who would press a quill into her small, steady hand and suggest lines. She learned the alphabet as some learn to breathe, through repetition until air remembers itself. Books arrived like rare birds. She traced their pages with a hunger, not because they were forbidden, but because they were the place language kept its secrets. From Latin primers to versified psalms, letters folded into sentences that folded back into her. And there, in the small chamber where sunlight entered at an angle, she began to lay claim to a voice that would astonish people who believed such astonishment impossible. That voice, when it first stepped out of the private rooms and into the public light, did so as a scandal and a marvel at once. Young, taught, and compelled by an intelligence that would not be caged, she composed poems that smelled of the sea and stained with the heat of sermons and the clink of teacups. They were poems of weather and scripture, of gratitude and the strange gratitude of one who had been taught to love those who kept her. They were, to some, improbable, to others, a provocation. In Boston in 1772, a panel of prominent men, merchants, clergymen, and scholars were summoned to determine an impossible thing. Could a woman taken from Africa and raised in an American household have produced skillful English verse without the assistance of white tutors? They convened more to put the question in public than to seek a true answer. The room became a stage. The examination meant to prove authorship became a performance of control. She stood while they sat. Her hands were not empty. There was ink on her fingers like a confession. They asked questions that felt like instruments. Where were you born? Who taught you to read? Who suggested the rhymes? The men wrote what she said. They watched her as if looking through her into some unknown and smaller world. In their minds, she was an experiment that, if validated, might trouble the very categories that kept the city upright. At the bench outside the parlor, across from the lamp, she recited. She read lines she had shaped, metered in her own breath, and the men listened, not only for the content, but for the impossibility of it. When she finished, their signatures followed as if on a ledger. An attestation, a brittle seal that said, in careful legal language, that they believed the verses came from her and from her alone. The attestation would travel with the book and, in the telling, would stand as both vindication and spectacle. Vindication did not become her freedom. The signatures could not undo the weight of ownership. They could not unname her. Yet the attestation carried a subtle, combustible power. It crossed the ocean with the book she would publish in London the following year. And in that crossing, it altered something in the way certain men looked at the idea of genius and whom might possess it. London published her poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in 1773. The book bore the testimony of those Boston gentlemen. And it bore, tucked among the elegies and the devotions, the fact of a mind that had learned 2 languages and used both. The road to that book had been braided with humiliation and constraint. She sat at the corner of household life, moving between the heat of the kitchen and the chill of drawing rooms where talk of the colonies and the king moved without her. She copied verses and learned classical names. Yet always the same question shadowed her. Would an audience accept the intelligence of a black woman when intelligence in that world was coded white? For every praise she received, a countercurrent of suspicion pooled underneath. To be praised publicly by white men was to be visible in a way that invited scrutiny, and scrutiny in that time was a thinly veiled form of ownership. There were smaller violences, private and persistent. The suggestion that her life was, in some sense, an entertainment, a curiosity for the drawing room's polite conversation, narrowed the margin of her self-possession. Visitors would ask to see the Negro girl that writes. They would watch as if she were an exhibit of propriety. Children would come to see her read, and their parents would make a show of being pleased. The Wheatleys themselves, who had educated her and encouraged her pen, lived in a tension between paternal pride and the economy that kept her bound to them. She wrote letters. She wrote poems that thanked God as much as they criticized what she could not name directly. Her religious verse was sincere and strategic. In a world that judged men by their piety, her devotion was not only private consolation, but a rhetorical defense. Gratitude could be both genuine and a means of negotiating a dangerous social terrain. The poems prayed and praised, and sometimes, like a slow tide, pushed at the shore of understanding by insisting on universal humanity in the language of Scripture. There were nights when she would take a candle and sit close to the window, watching the ship's masts align like ribs against the sky. Once, she held a scrap of paper beneath the lamplight and cut a lock of her own hair with trembling scissors, sealing it in a tidy fold as if preserving a piece of herself for far future hands. Hair, in that gesture, meant more than vanity. It meant an archive of the body. She preserved it because she had learned, from the house's kitchen and from the world beyond, that bodies are what remain when names are auctioned away. The city watched as if watching a coin thrown into a well. Some saw meaning, some merely ripples. Then came the public performance of authority, not the men who attested to her authorship, but the larger public apparatus that decided who could or could not be believed. Her case became entangled in the politics of the moment. Colonies muttered about liberty, and yet the liberties they imagined rarely admitted those they had enslaved into their circle. The contradiction was a needle that stitched through the fabric of her life. After the London edition, there was hope of mobility. Invitations, letters from afar, praise recorded in newspapers. But the praise was ambivalent. It applauded the novelty as much as the merit. When strangers wrote of her, they often made her the exception that proved the rule. Her genius was used to buttress arguments, that the human mind was universal, or that the colonists' cause could be made moral. Her lines were quoted by people whose own hands did not hesitate to count her as property. In January evenings, when frost made geometry of window panes, she could imagine a different world for herself, a room where a book belonged to her alone, where the income from sales could purchase passage out of dependence. The Wheatleys had taught her letters, and in teaching had enacted both benevolence and containment. They were not monsters in her memory. They were the household that taught her the grammar of grief. The paradox of gratitude to those who had enslaved her complicated the narrative, making it harder to place blame in easy, comfortable terms. She loved the family that raised her, and at the same time, their kindness was a gilding over an essential injury. There were men who would later call for her freedom. Patrons and supporters, those who had heard her recite and had signed testimony, argued in polite letters to arrange the logistics of publication overseas and of ensuring copies reached the right eyes. The money from the London sale was meager after costs and all the hands that needed paying. The economics of print did not bend easily to the project of liberating a person whose sale had once been an exchange of property. Yet petitions began to circulate, cautious and careful, to secure for her at least the legal standing of a free person. When the Wheatley family did finally grant manumission, accounts differ, and prudence requires language like reported or said to have. Some contemporaries recorded that her freedom was purchased, or that the family freed her shortly after the book's success. Others suggest a slower negotiation. The alignment of publication and emancipation was not simple cause and effect. Legal liberty did not transform the daily experience overnight. It could not erase past humiliations, nor the public rituals that had demanded her proof and spectacle. Freedom, juridically declared, met the reality that many doors remained closed to her in practice. Between those two states, captivity and legal freedom, lay a territory of emotional residue. She had to learn to walk without the house's schedule dictating her mornings. She had to navigate the market and the press without the household mediators who had once smoothed conversation for her. She met with a world that professed admiration but too often withheld trust. Publishers in London flattered and negotiated, but a woman of color with no family fortune and an uncertain patronage network had little cushion. She married in 1778 to John Peters, a free black man, and the marriage carried hope and soon hardship. The world she entered was not designed for her unique intersection of visibility and vulnerability. Economic precarity trailed her like a shadow. Yet even amid want, her verse continued to exist as a stubborn proof that knowledge could be produced in cramped rooms and under watchful eyes. Her poems were read aloud in parlors and quoted in arguments about human capacities. They remained small, stubborn lighthouses against the vast coastline of indifference. What had been done to her before freedom was not only the familiar physical transaction of slavery. It was a succession of performances and tests designed to diminish the credibility of a person whose mind might otherwise disturb comfortable hierarchies. To be required to prove one's intellect in public is to be told again and again that one's presence is suspicious unless sanctioned. Each attestation, each signature appended to the preface of her book was itself a negotiation of dignity. Without it, perhaps she would have been dismissed. With it, she was validated, but only through the benevolence of those very listeners who could at any time turn their gaze away. The examination in Boston remains the defining humiliation in the public memory of her life. A gentle woman, a child once, now asked to justify her existence as a thinking being. They asked for proofs, as if knowledge could be isolated and displayed like a pocket watch. She complied with the patience of someone used to making room for other people's comforts. She read and answered without rancor. Yet inside, behind the composure, there was a well of private astonishment that her poems could elicit such scrutiny. It is tempting and dangerously easy to reduce her to a single story, the prodigy enslaved who proved herself. But her life refuses such simplification. She loved, she disappointed, she was disappointed. She wrote letters that revealed affection for friends, bitterness at slights, and a faith complicated by the reality she lived in. Her poetry, sometimes devotional, sometimes personal, reflected a mind oriented toward the larger questions of justice and human dignity long before those words were fashionable in the salons that applauded her. In quieter moments, she would press her forehead against the window glass and watch carts pass with their covered goods and horses' breath turning to steam. The city had seasons of noise and patience, of market voices and the low chant of preachers. Sometimes she would awake in the night with a line in her head and slip out of bed to capture it on paper, the candle's flame flinging shadows as if script were summoning spirits. In those nights, the world contracted to the small geometry of a desk and the slow ceremony of making language. The motifs gathered around her life: a candle for the inner light that was often the only illumination permitted, a scrap of hair folded away like an inheritance, the white of paper as a blankness she would fill with thought. These images recur because they are what remained when furniture moved and houses emptied. They are the relics of interiority, the small objects that carried memory forward. As the public appetite for novelty shifted, sometimes inflamed by politics, sometimes soothed, the institutions that had once demanded her validation turned to other matters. For a while, her name circulated in newspapers and in the parlors of Boston and London. Then questions of final belonging returned. Where would she place herself once legally free? What would freedom mean when so many doors remained shut? The promise of the printed book had created a path, but not a destination. The truth of what was done to her is not reducible to a single act. It is the accumulation, being pulled from a homeland, being made to recite one's intelligence under watchful judgment, being commodified in polite conversation, being thanked in print by those who held the power to free or to dismiss. It is also the small resistances, her poems that refuse to be only about gratitude, her insistence on addressing public figures as if they owed a moral account, her steady practice of shaping words when the world sought to shape her. This tension between external humiliation and internal art is the core of what happened to her before freedom. In the winter light of a street lamp, an older woman remembered a girl who could assemble syllables like birds. Some records preserve the facts. A book published in London, testimonials signed, a subsequent manumission recorded in household papers. Other vital details are fogged by the years. The private humiliations not written down, the small acts of tenderness that never made the margins of newspapers. Therefore, where the archive falls silent, imagination must be careful. It must preserve dignity while filling gaps with plausible interior life, always signaling that those spoken words are reconstructions. There are shards of reproach in the historical voice. Critics who would use her talents as a cudgel for their own theories. Patrons who professed admiration and still supported institutions of bondage. To name what they did to her is to name a social mechanism. The insistence on spectacle as a condition of belief. The use of scrutiny to maintain hierarchies. The way praise can be a slow, dangerous form of consumption. She navigated these without theatrical complaint, with the quiet labor of someone who knew the price of anger. Her composed voice was not acquiescence. It was a strategy to survive and to utter truth. When at last the legal shackle was struck from her name, freedom arrived as both relief and new exposure. Freed women and men of color found themselves legally unbound but socially constrained. The marketplace of work and the social marketplace did not readily admit those who had been property. She found that publication did not guarantee prosperity, nor did the signatures of prominent men ensure a future where her words could be the sole currency. And yet, her poems endure, not as trophies but as witness. They mark the presence of thought where power sought to deny it. They complicate the neat narratives many prefer. She was not merely a curiosity to be examined and then boxed away. She was a voice that entered the conversation and demanded to be reckoned with. The cruel, intimate things done to her before she held a paper marked legally free were numerous and structural. They were made of gestures as much as laws. The repeated need to prove possession of mind, the public spectacle of validation, the small daily diminutions that accumulate. But in that same narrative thread, there is also the stubborn act of writing, a woman shaping syllables that outlast the men who signed attestations and outlast the polite curiosities of drawing rooms. There is a final image that will not leave those who consider her life. A candle, guttering and then steady, not extinguished by the wind of prejudice. For all that was done to Phillis Wheatley before freedom, she retained an inner flame that her examiners could not extinguish. It is this flame that complicates, that resists simple pity, and that insists on the human dignity at the heart of the story. If this account touched you, reflect on what it asks. Who in our histories were required to prove their humanity? Leave a thought or a comment below.
Consider subscribing if you want more stories that put a human face on historical injustices and the individuals who kept their light burning.
The work continues. Her poetry remains a doorway into the contradictions of liberty as it was imagined and as it was denied. The road ahead for her was not yet concluded in public memory. There are later years of marriage, struggle, and a death that left questions unanswered. There are descendants of her words who would retell and recontextualize her life. What remains is the care to keep listening and to keep asking what it cost to demand that an enslaved girl prove the poetry that had always been hers. She married John Peters in 1778. The registries keep the name, the date, the terse domestic notation that often stands where interior life should be. What they cannot tell us is the reasoned intimacy that led two people to bind themselves in a world that offered scant protection to either of them. We may suppose that marriage promised shelter from an exposed public life, that it offered the possibility, so precarious then, of a household under one's own modest control. We may also suppose that companionship came with complications. Peters was a man whose fortunes wavered, whose troubles multiplied in the brittle credit networks of the time. The papers that survive record petitions and claims, an attempt to revive literary effort, appeals that reached few sympathetic ears. Where the archive falls quiet, imagination must be careful. It must avoid turning guesswork into gossip. Yet even careful conjecture may fill a useful space. A woman who had known the startling intimacy of being read aloud by admiring men, who had lived under scrutiny since childhood, now confronted the unadorned business of keeping a household and caring for children born into a brittle freedom. Those children, the names and number once recorded, then reduced to marginal notes, did not all survive. Infant graves were common in the city. Clinicians of the time offered no cures for the social causes of premature death. Letters speak of grief folded into the ordinary rhythm of days, a sorrow that had no public theater and therefore left no headlines. There is no spectacle here to satisfy the appetite of curiosity, only the small domestic devastations that every historian learns to handle with restraint. The empty cradle, the washed and folded linen, the habit of walking room to room expecting a cry that never comes. If we imagine Phillis at a bedside, candle guttering, pencil poised over a page, composing a line that will not outlast her own exhaustion, that image must be offered as plausibility rather than proof. The certainty is elsewhere. She survived loss and continued to write even as her resources narrowed. The attempt to secure a second volume of poems became a measure of that narrowing. It is recorded, in the stubbornly bureaucratic way of subscription lists and notices, that efforts were made, letters sent, subscribers sought, envelopes passed beneath doors. But funds did not appear in the numbers needed. The very men who had once signed attestations on her behalf and who had lent their signatures to establish her credibility as a poet were less inclined to open their purses when asked to underwrite further publication. Admiration had a way of being elegant and rhetorical rather than financial. The world that had applauded her in parlors and printed laudatory petitions did not easily convert moral approval into sustained economic support. The market, as it were, required more than praise. It required patrons willing to risk capital on a woman who had been, only recently, legally property. Poverty crept in, at times public and humiliating, at times private and stubbornly silent. Accounts suggest petitions for small loans, pleas for assistance, the sale of household goods. A woman who had once conversed in verse with heads of state now wrote letters of an urgent domestic kind. People in the city remembered her presence, the cadence of her speech, the posture of her writing hand, the way she folded a page. There were acquaintances who tried to help, and friends who could not. There were the ordinary cruelties of debt collectors, the ordinary indifference of a society in which the rights of newly freed persons remained theoretical.
Her husband's ventures, some shrewd, some mismanaged, did not bring sufficient stability. Whether by misfortune or by choices made in a world limited in options, the household's precariousness persisted. She did not, however, relinquish the work that had first announced her voice to a wider world. The poems already in print continued to travel, to be copied, to be quoted, to be used in sermons and abolitionist pamphlets. Abolitionists found in her lines an argument that could be wielded against the cruelty of bondage. Here was evidence that intellect and moral sense did not respect the artificial color lines that sustained chattel slavery. Yet to reduce her poems to mere ammunition in a political contest would be to undo their artistry. They were used by many causes, appropriated and praised, dismissed and admired. Critics renewed old accusations. Was the genius hers alone? And each new critique reopened wounds that had once been stared down in a Boston parlor. The scholarly disputes are part of her afterlife. They matter, but they are not the whole of it. Her death in 1784 closed a life of compressed brightness and hard endings. The record gives the date, the small notice in a newspaper perhaps, the note that she was gone. What followed was a domestic dispersal typical of those who left few possessory claims. Curtains taken down, dishes sold, debts tallied. Contemporary notice of her passing was modest. The parlor conversations that had once clustered around her person dispersed like the last ash of a candle. Yet even in the smallness of that public response, there lingered a peculiar recognition. Readers who had once been moved by her lines remembered what she had accomplished in a voice that was both restrained and exacting. The lack of a grand funeral or a sustained obituary did not erase the fact of her work. Instead, it folded her into a quieter folk memory that would later be reopened by voices determined to trace literary history differently. The 19th century found Phillis Wheatley again and again, though through lenses that seldom let her be only herself. Abolitionists in England and America quoted her to contest the presumed inferiority of black minds. They displayed her as a contradiction to their opponents' arguments. Yet those same readers sometimes used her as a precedent that flattened the particularity of her life into a rhetorical instrument. Later generations, scholars, poets, activists, returned to her poems to save them from reductive use. They read for craft rather than for mere proof. They noted the classical references and the deft rhetorical turns, yes, but they also attended to the places where a private grief seemed to intrude on public rhetoric, where an intimate doubt softened a grand apostrophe. In that layered attention, Wheatley's work shifted from being a curiosity to being a subject worthy of literary criticism in its own right. Modern readers, those who came to her in the 20th and 21st centuries, have been prodigal in their interpretations. Some have read her as a conservative figure, attracted to the moral language of the day. Others locate in her lines a subterranean resistance, an insistence that the very act of poetic composition was in itself a contradiction to the world that made her both spectacle and commodity. Feminist critics have asked about the cost of being a woman whose intellectual labor was publicly assessed by men whose power lay beyond the page. Post-colonial readers have traced connections between her classical learning and an appropriation of European modes as a means to be heard within them. None of these readings exhausts her. Each reveals a facet. What endures most insistently is the image readers return to. A paper page with ink washed slightly by time. A careful signature at the bottom that reads as both claim and testament. There is, too, the quieter artifact of memory. The way a family might remember a line quoted over dinner, or how a teacher might have insisted that a child learn a stanza by heart. These are small continuities, not spectacular ones, but they are the ways in which art survives the vicissitudes of public life. Her poems continue to be read aloud in classrooms, in meetings, in private rooms where someone seeks a language for endurance. They withstand because they speak to conditions both particular and universal. the desire for expression, the search for moral shape, the ache of loss.
We must also attend, now, to the people who inherited the work in other, less obvious ways. Those who read Wheatley's survivals and found permission to speak. Those who read her as a precedent and therefore entered the conversation about nationhood, about freedom, about who is allowed to shape the public voice. Poets who came after her, Black poets in particular, have sometimes regarded her as a precursor whose very existence complicated the claim that poetic thought could be used to police humanity. The line between admiration and revision is often narrow. Later writers reclaimed her as a witness while insisting on reading the absences in her archive as loudly as they read the presences. There is yet another inheritance, the scholarly labor of disentangling life from myth. Archivists and biographers have pieced together bills, letters, and lists to reconstruct the contours of a life that official records rarely honored. In doing so, they have learned to mark their conjectures, to state plainly where records speak and where imagination supplies possibility. That rigorous humility is part of the ethical work of telling lives like hers. To illuminate without appropriating, to narrate without replacing, to respect what remains unknown. And so we return, finally, to the domestic image that began this meditation, the candle guttering, then steady, then passed to another hand. The flame persists because readers have kept it so, because poems were copied, because lines were taught, because someone carried a page folded in a pocket, because later voices thought the trouble of listening to her worth the labor. Her life was shaped by laws and by tenderness, by mercy and by insult, by praise that often dressed as consumption. The narrative of Phillis Wheatley resists tidy endings. It invites ongoing attention. There remain, in the papers and in the margins of history, lines not yet fully traced, small registers unopened, notes that might change an argument or only shade it more deeply. We will look next at one of those margins, an unpublished fragment, a stray stanza preserved in a private hand, its meter unsteady and its rhetoric intimate. An instance where the public poet and the private woman brush against each other and do not entirely reconcile. The fragment asks us to listen close, to hold conjecture lightly, and to allow a life to be seen as both testimony and mystery.